Every morning in Millbrook, Sarah Johnson's footsteps echo through Main Street just as the sun peeks over the horizon. At 42, she carries herself with quiet dignity, her warm brown eyes and gentle smile known to everyone in this town of 20,000. They don't call her Director Johnson, despite her running the biggest community center in the county. Here she's simply Miss Sarah, the woman who turned an old failing building into the beating heart of their community. Born and raised in Millbrook's East Side, Sarah learned early that change doesn't just happen, it takes work. Her grandmother had been a civil rights activist, her mother a teacher, and Sarah combined both their spirits into something uniquely her own. 15 years ago, when the community center faced closure, she stepped in with just $200 in her bank account and a determination that wouldn't quit. Today, that same center serves over 500 kids weekly, offering everything from hot meals to college prep classes. Please like and subscribe right now as we upload stories every day. The kids she helps call her their guardian angel, but Sarah brushes off such praise with a laugh. Her real pride lies in their success stories, like Marcus, who went from potential dropout to straight A student, or Keisha, who just became the first in her family to get a college acceptance letter. Every morning, Sarah's routine stays the same. Coffee with two sugars, a worn leather bag filled with paperwork and permission slips, and a brisk 15-minute walk to start her day. What makes Sarah special isn't just what she does, but how she does it. In a town still quietly divided by old prejudices, she builds bridges without making a fuss about it. The yearly fundraiser she organized last summer brought together folks from both sides of the tracks, raising $50,000 to renovate the center's library. She doesn't just help people, she helps them help themselves. That Wednesday morning started like any other. Sarah had no way of knowing that her walk to work would shake their small town to its core and expose wounds they'd all pretended didn't exist. She just adjusted her bright blue cardigan, checked her phone for messages from her husband James, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The community center was waiting, and Miss Sarah was never late. The morning sun had barely warmed the sidewalk when two police cruisers rolled up beside Sarah. 9:17 a.m., the security cameras would later show. She was just 4 blocks from the community center, wearing her usual smile and carrying a tote bag full of children's books for morning reading time. Officer Mark Davidson, 3 years on the force, stepped out first. His partner, rookie Tom Reynolds, followed. Neither had ever worked this side of town before. The dash cam would later reveal their casual laughter, their relaxed postures, just two cops who thought they'd found some morning entertainment. "Hey you! Stop right there!" Davidson called out. Sarah paused, clutching her bag closer. She taught dozens of kids how to handle police encounters. Stay calm, be respectful, know your rights. Now she'd live those lessons herself. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. What happened next would be replayed thousands of times across social media. Tom grabbed her bag, dumping those carefully chosen children's books onto the dirty sidewalk. When Sarah instinctively reached to save them, Davidson shoved her against the cruiser. Her head hit the metal with a thud that made nearby pedestrians gasp. "Getting rowdy, huh?" Davidson smirked, exchanging glances with his partner. "Let's see how you like being taught a lesson." They didn't know about her law degree, didn't know about her husband, State Supreme Court Justice James Johnson. They just saw what they wanted to see, another black woman they could humiliate because they wore badges. Mrs. Chen from the corner store started recording. So did Marcus's older brother Deshaun, his hands shaking as he held up his phone. But neither officer cared about the growing crowd. They were too busy dragging Sarah to the metal pole outside Richardson's Hardware, her cardigan ripping at the sleeve. "Please," Sarah said, her dignity intact even as they zip-tied her wrists around the pole. "This is illegal. I have rights." Davidson just laughed. Reynolds, looking slightly uncertain now, still played along. They posed for mock selfies beside her, making gang signs and laughing while Sarah stood tall, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. 9-year-old Katie Martinez, who Sarah had tutored just yesterday, watched from across the street. "Miss Sarah!" Her small voice carried across the growing crowd. "Mama, why are they hurting Miss Sarah?" The shame of that moment would haunt Sarah more than any physical pain. It took exactly 6 minutes. 6 minutes for two cops to expose the ugly truth beneath Millbrook's peaceful facade. 6 minutes caught on 7 different phones from 7 different angles. 6 minutes that would soon explode across the nation. At 9:23 a.m., Sergeant Linda Rodriguez arrived, responding to multiple 911 calls. Her dash cam caught her sharp intake of breath at the scene. Sarah still tied to the pole, her dignity a silent rebellion against the humiliation, while a crowd of about 50 people recorded everything. Some were crying, others were shouting. All were witnesses to something unforgivable. "Get her down, now!" Rodriguez's voice cracked like a whip. Davidson and Reynolds' smirks finally faded as their superior officer cut Sarah free, apologizing quietly while checking her wrist for damage. But the real damage wasn't physical. It was in Katie's confused tears, in Deshawn's shaking hands, in Mrs. Chen's quiet prayers in Mandarin. Sarah smoothed her torn cardigan, picked up her scattered books with trembling fingers that refused to show fear. "Your badge numbers," she said quietly. "I'll be needing them." Rodriguez was already calling for an ambulance, but Sarah shook her head. "Number, I need to make a phone call first." She pulled out her phone, pressed a single number on speed dial. The crowd fell silent as she spoke 6 words that would change everything. "James, it's me. It's happened here too." What Officers Davidson and Reynolds didn't know as they started their paperwork, still grumbling about uppity attitudes, was that Sarah Johnson wasn't just any community leader. She was the woman who'd helped dismantle their entire department. And her husband, Justice James Johnson, had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this kind of fight. The next morning, their smirking faces would be on every news channel in America. But Sarah wouldn't watch. She'd be at the community center, reading to the children, showing them through quiet strength how to face hatred with dignity. Some battles are won not with fists or shouts, but with an unbreakable spirit that refuses to be broken. State Supreme Court Justice James Johnson was in the middle of reviewing a case when his phone buzzed. One glance at Sarah's name, and his heart stopped. They'd been married 23 years, and she never called during court hours. Never. His hands trembled as he stepped out of the courtroom, his black robe suddenly heavy on his shoulders. "Baby, breathe. Just breathe for me," he said, hearing her fighting for composure. Sarah, his rock, his partner. The woman who ironed his robes every Sunday night while humming gospel songs. Sarah, who'd supported him through law school by working 3 jobs. Sarah, who never asked for recognition despite doing more for their community than any elected official. His Sarah tied to a pole like an animal. He listened, each word burning into his memory. His wife's voice, always strong, always sure, now shook with humiliation. But there was something else there too. Determination. The same fire he'd fallen in love with when they were just 2 kids dreaming of changing the world in their college's Black Student Union. "I want them to learn, James," she whispered. "Not just these 2 officers, the whole system. But I want to do it right. No riots, no violence, just pure, clean justice." Even in her pain, she was thinking of others. That was Sarah, always the teacher, always the healer. James canceled his afternoon sessions. His clerk, Jenny, took one look at his face and silently rescheduled 2 weeks of cases. In 20 years, she'd never seen him use his emergency leave. As he drove home, memories flooded back. Sarah helping him prepare for his bar exam, quizzing him while 8 months pregnant with their first child. Sarah organizing fundraisers for his campaign for district judge, even though they could barely afford rent. Sarah beaming with quiet pride at his Supreme Court swearing in, standing in the back so others could have better seats. He found her at the community center, reading to a group of children as if nothing had happened. But he saw how her hands gripped the book too tightly, saw the torn cardigan she tried to mend, saw the marks on her wrists that she'd covered with bangles. Their eyes met across the room, and 2 decades of shared battles passed between them. The kids noticed him first. "Judge James!" they called out. They knew him from career day, from Christmas celebrations, from the Saturday mentoring sessions Sarah had somehow convinced him to join. He managed a smile, but his jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Story time's over early today, little ones," Sarah announced, her voice warm despite everything. "Remember your vocabulary words for tomorrow?" The children filed out, some hugging her waist, others waving shyly at James. One little girl, Katie, lingered. "Miss Sarah," Katie's voice quivered. "Those bad police won't come back, will they? My mama said you're going to make them sorry." Sarah knelt down, wincing slightly from where the handcuffs had cut her skin. "Katie, honey, listen to me. Not all police are bad, and we don't fight wrong with wrong. We're going to fix this the right way to make sure it never happens to anyone else. That's what real justice is about." James watched his wife comfort a scared child while carrying her own trauma, and something in him shifted. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about Katie, about all the children who'd witnessed their beloved Miss Sarah humiliated, about every black child who'd grown up thinking this was normal, about every officer who thought a badge was a license to terrorize. When Katie left, Sarah finally let her composure crack. James held her as she shook, her tears soaking his expensive suit. "I kept thinking about your mother," she whispered, "about that photo of her at the lunch counter sit-in, about how she held her head high while they poured coffee on her. I tried to make her proud today." James thought of his mother who died last year, how she'd loved Sarah like a daughter, how she'd made them promise to keep fighting the good fight, but to fight it with dignity. "Mama would have been so proud of you, baby," he murmured into Sarah's hair. "And now it's my turn to make you proud." He pulled out his phone, made 3 calls. First to Attorney General Maria Santos, his former law school classmate. Then to FBI Civil Rights Division Chief Marcus Chen, who owed him for supporting his appointment. Finally to Gloria Washington at the Equal Justice Initiative. With each call, the wheels of justice began turning faster. But Sarah touched his arm. "James," she said softly, "I don't want to destroy them. Those officers, well, they're somebody's children too. They need to learn, not burn. Promise me we'll do this right. Promise me we'll make this matter." Looking into his wife's eyes, James Johnson saw what true justice looked like. Not revenge, not destruction, but transformation. Sarah had spent her life building bridges while he'd focused on winning cases. Maybe it was time to build something together. "I promise," he said, helping her gather the scattered storybooks. "We'll make this count. For Katie, for our community, for every person who's ever felt powerless against a badge." He picked up To Kill a Mockingbird from her bag. She'd been teaching it to her teen reading group. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. As they walked home together, neighbors came out to their porches. Some offered hugs. Others just nodded respectfully. Mrs. Chen hurried out of her store to press a jar of healing herbs into Sarah's hands. Deshawn, still shaken from filming the incident, promised to help at the center while she took time to recover. But Sarah had no intention of taking time off. "The children need normalcy," she told James as they reached their home, "and I need to show them that hate doesn't win, that justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a torn cardigan and carries children's books." James watched his wife climb their porch steps, her back straight despite everything. He thought about power, how some found it in badges and handcuffs, while others, like Sarah, found it in quiet acts of perseverance. Tomorrow he would begin dismantling a system that thought it could break his wife's spirit. But tonight he would hold her close, listening as she planned tomorrow's reading lesson, marveling at the unbreakable dignity of the woman he loved. The headlines would soon explode. Supreme Court Justice's wife humiliated by racist cops. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was about a woman who taught everyone around her, even in her darkest moment, what true justice looks like, and about a man who held the power to change laws, but learned from his wife that real change starts in the heart. News travels fast in small towns, but rage travels faster. By sunset, every phone in Millbrook buzzed with the video. Mothers watched it at dinner tables, hands pressed to their mouths. Fathers paced living rooms, fists clenched. Teenagers shared it with shaking hands and tear-streaked faces. Miss Sarah, their Miss Sarah, tied to a pole like it was 1963 all over again. Jenny Martinez, the cafeteria lady at Millbrook High, threw up after watching it. She'd seen Sarah just yesterday, helping her son with college applications. "She spent 3 hours on his essay," Jenny sobbed to her husband. 3 hours of her own time, Miguel, and they treated her like she wasn't even human. At the First Baptist Church, Pastor Mike Thomas canceled his planned sermon. Instead, he played the video on the giant screens, usually reserved for worship songs. The congregation sat in stunned silence, broken only by muffled sobs and angry mutters. "My God," whispered elderly Mrs. Robinson, who'd marched with Dr. King. "My God, we're still here. After all these years, we're still here." The police station's phones wouldn't stop ringing. Officer Linda Rodriguez, who'd cut Sarah free, sat at her desk with her head in her hands. 23 years on the force, and she'd never felt such shame. The chief was hiding in his office, desperately calling PR firms. But there's no PR fix for raw hatred caught on camera. By midnight, Main Street filled with people. No one organized it, no one led it. They just came, hundreds of them, holding candles and cell phones with Sarah's photo. Black and white, young and old, rich and poor. The town's invisible lines of segregation melted away in the face of undeniable truth. Katie, the little girl who watched it happen, couldn't sleep. Her mother found her sitting in their kitchen at 2 a.m., cutting out paper hearts. "They're for Miss Sarah," she explained, tears rolling down her cheeks, "to cover up the bad spots on the pole." By morning, that metal pole disappeared under thousands of paper hearts, each one carrying a message of love. At the high school, students walked out of first period in silence. Principal Harris watched them go, remembering how Sarah had talked him out of quitting last year when the job felt too hard. He joined them, removing his tie and picking up a sign that read, "Justice for Miss Sarah." The community center's doors stayed open. Sarah insisted on it, even as James begged her to rest. "Our kids need to see strength today," she told him, covering the bruises on her wrists with silver bangles. But today was different. Today, wealthy women from the north side came to volunteer. Their husbands wrote checks. Their children joined the reading circles. Reporters swarmed the town like locusts. CNN vans clogged the streets. Everyone wanted to talk to Sarah, to James, to the officers. But the real story played out in quiet moments they missed. Like when Officer Rodriguez's teenage daughter told her mom she was ashamed of her badge. Or when old Mr. Peterson, who'd never set foot in the community center, showed up with his toolbox to fix anything Sarah needed. The officers who did it, Davidson and Reynolds, sat in their homes with drawn blinds. Their wives stopped going to church. Their kids got pulled from school. Davidson's mother called him crying, "How could you? I raised you better than this." Reynolds threw up twice, watching himself laughing on the video. His black partner from the academy stopped taking his calls. At the grocery store, Mrs. Chen placed a photo of Sarah in her window. "Best customer," she wrote in careful English. "Best heart." Other stores followed. Soon Sarah's smile watched over every street that had witnessed her humiliation. But she wasn't just a symbol anymore. She was a mirror, reflecting back what Millbrook had become and what it needed to be. The town council called an emergency meeting. They expected anger. They got something worse. Disappointment. For 3 hours, citizens lined up to speak. A teenage boy described how Sarah helped him after his father died. A white kindergarten teacher broke down, describing how Sarah had paid for her cancer treatments. Officer Rodriguez stood up in uniform and said, "This isn't who we're supposed to be." But it was Katie who changed everything. Tiny Katie, clutching her paper hearts, walking to the microphone that was taller than her. "Miss Sarah teaches us that hurt people," she said in her small voice. "But she also says that love people. So maybe if we love the police more, they wouldn't be so mean. But they have to say sorry first, really sorry, and promise to learn better." The room fell silent. Sarah, sitting in the back, wiped tears from her eyes. James squeezed her hand. This was their town, in all its broken beauty. Not perfect, not even close, but ready, finally ready, to face its demons. As the meeting ended, people didn't rush home. They lingered, talking to neighbors they'd never really seen before. Mrs. Robinson taught Katie's mom the songs she'd sung at civil rights marches. Officer Rodriguez hugged Sarah, whispering apologies for every time she'd stayed silent. Principal Harris and Pastor Mike planned a community unity day. The media called it a racial reckoning, but for Millbrook, it was something simpler and harder. It was growing up, looking in the mirror and not liking what they saw, choosing finally to change. That night, as Sarah and James watched the news coverage, she turned to him with tired eyes. "You know what hurts most?" she said softly. Tomorrow, somewhere else, another black person will be humiliated, and maybe they won't have a Supreme Court justice for a husband. Maybe no one will film it. Maybe nothing will change. James held her close. Then we'll keep working, he promised. Not just for laws, but for hearts. One town at a time, one person at a time, until Katie's children live in a world where paper hearts are just for Valentine's Day. Outside their window, Millbrook kept vigil, hundreds of candles twinkling in the darkness. A town awakening to its own conscience. One painful truth at a time. The internal affairs investigation opened like a can of worms nobody wanted to touch. Officer Mark Davidson's personnel file sat on Captain Rivera's desk. 13 complaints in 3 years, all mysteriously marked resolved. His partner, Tom Reynolds, had 5 in just 8 months. Both had come from the same police academy. Both had the same instructor, retired Sergeant Bill Hayes, known for teaching rookies how to handle trouble. I trained them to be tough, Hayes defended himself to the investigation board, his weathered face red with anger. Not to be monsters. But as he reviewed the footage again, his hands shook. These weren't the officers he thought he'd shaped. Or maybe they were exactly what he'd created, and he just couldn't bear to see it. Davidson's wife Susan hadn't spoken to him in 3 days. She'd taken their kids to her mother's house, leaving a note. I married a protector, not a bully. At night, alone in their empty house, he watched the video over and over. Each time he looked for justification, for something that made his actions okay. Each time, he only saw himself becoming the very thing he'd sworn to fight against. Reynolds broke first. In a tearful confession to Internal Affairs, he described the unofficial training senior officers gave rookies. They told us which neighborhoods needed extra attention, he said, voice cracking. They said some people only respect force. I wanted to fit in. I wanted them to think I was tough. As he spoke, his mother's words echoed in his head. That badge means you serve everyone, Tommy. Everyone. The investigation dug deeper. Old complaints surfaced. Similar incidents swept under the rug. Officer Rodriguez, who'd cut Sarah free, brought forward her own reports of misconduct she'd witnessed over years. I stayed quiet too long, she admitted, turning in her badge and gun. I'm not taking them back until we fix this. All of it. At the police academy, instructors held emergency meetings. They reviewed their training materials, finding subtle biases in every module. The scenario training always featured suspects from certain neighborhoods. The de-escalation techniques were taught as a last resort, not a first response. Even the photos in their textbooks told a story of unconscious prejudice. Davidson's teenage daughter Emma stopped using his last name at school. My father is one of them, she told her counselor, tears streaming down her face. I saw him laughing in that video, laughing while he hurt someone's mom, someone's wife. How do I live with that? The counselor had no answer, but across town, Sarah Johnson did. Sarah agreed to meet both officers, not for their redemption, but for their education. The meeting happened at the community center after hours. James stood guard outside, every muscle tense. Inside, Sarah faced her abusers with the same dignity they tried to strip from her. I want you to meet someone, she told them, pulling out her phone. The screen showed a black teenager in a graduation gown. This is Marcus. Last year, he was stopped by police 7 times in 1 month. Never charged, never arrested, just stopped. He almost dropped out of school from the shame. But he didn't, because his community held him up. That's what police should do. Hold people up, not push them down. Reynolds broke down sobbing. Davidson stared at his hands, seeing them through new eyes. Hands that had caused pain instead of preventing it. Sarah showed them more photos. Katie's artwork, the teen reading group, elderly folks at computer classes. This is your community too, she said softly. Every person you degraded is someone's whole world. The next day, both officers submitted their resignations, but Sarah surprised everyone by rejecting them. Running away doesn't fix anything, she told the review board. If they're willing to learn, to really change, then make them work for it. Make them serve the community they hurt. Make them understand what protection really means. Captain Rivera created a new training program with Sarah as lead civilian advisor. The badge of trust became mandatory for every officer, focusing on community integration, bias recognition, and the history they'd never learned in academy. Officers spent shifts at the community center, not as guards but as students, learning from the very people they'd been taught to suspect. Davidson started small, helping with the after-school homework program. The kids were wary at first, but Sarah's acceptance slowly opened doors. One evening, he helped Marcus's younger brother with math. "You're not so scary without your uniform," the boy said. Davidson felt the weight of those words in his soul. Reynolds took a different path, working with elderly residents, escorting them to doctor appointments, learning their stories. Mrs. Robinson, the civil rights veteran, told him about her father, a sheriff in Mississippi who changed sides during the freedom rides. "Change is possible," she told him, patting his hand, "but it starts with facing your own heart." The hardest moment came when Katie, the little girl who'd made paper hearts, visited the station with her class. She saw Davidson and froze, terror in her eyes. He knelt down, removed his badge, and spoke from his heart. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. And I'm learning to be better because of brave people like you and Miss Sarah." Officer Rodriguez resumed her duties, but differently now. She started each shift at the community center, checking in with Sarah, learning what her neighborhood really needed. Protection doesn't always wear a uniform, she realized. Sometimes it looks like a woman in a torn cardigan, carrying hope in a bag full of books. The media wanted a simple story: racist cops punished, justice served. But Sarah knew better. True change doesn't come from punishment alone, but from transformation. As she watched Davidson reading to children and Reynolds helping elderly residents, she saw something bigger than justice. She saw healing. "The badge isn't just metal," she told a new class of recruits. "It's a promise to see the humanity in everyone, even those who look different, live different, think different, especially them, because a protector who only protects some isn't protecting at all. They're just guarding their own prejudice." The courthouse felt different that Monday morning. People packed the benches, not just lawyers and clerks, but regular folks from all over town. Miss Chen closed her store. Katie's mom took a day off work. Marcus skipped basketball practice. They all came to watch justice unfold. Sarah sat in the front row wearing her favorite blue dress, the one she'd worn to James's swearing-in ceremony. Her hands shook a little, but her head was high. Next to her sat Mrs. Robinson, old and frail but fierce as ever, holding Sarah's hand like it was her own daughter's. "You're not alone, baby," Mrs. Robinson whispered. "Look behind you." Sarah turned to see hundreds of faces, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, all there for her. Katie waved from her mom's lap, wearing a t-shirt that said Miss Sarah's student. Even Officer Rodriguez showed up in plain clothes, sitting quietly in the back. The lawyers tried to make it complicated, using big words and fancy legal talk, but everyone knew the truth was simple. The security videos played on the big screen, showing everything. Some people cried. Others had to leave the room. Sarah watched it all, her face calm even when they showed her tied to that pole. James wasn't allowed to be the judge. He was too close to the case. Instead, he sat behind his wife, not as a Supreme Court justice, but as a husband whose heart broke every time he watched that video. Their teenage son, Marcus Jr., squeezed his dad's shoulder, being strong for both his parents. Davidson and Reynolds looked different now. No uniforms, just plain suits that didn't quite fit right. Davidson's daughter Emma sat far from her father, closer to Sarah's family than her own. That hurt him more than any punishment could. "Tell us what happened that morning," the prosecutor asked Sarah. She stood up, smoothed her dress, and spoke in the same gentle voice she used to read stories to children. No fancy words, no legal language, just the truth, plain and simple. "I was walking to work," she began, "the same walk I've taken for 15 years. I was thinking about the reading circle I had planned for the kids." Her voice carried through the silent courtroom, painting a picture everyone could understand. Not just what happened, but how it felt. The fear, the shame, but mostly the sadness for what her community's children had to witness. The defense lawyers tried to make excuses: bad training, stress on the job, misunderstanding the situation. But Sarah's lawyer, a young woman named Michelle who'd once been in Sarah's youth program, had a simple response. "My client runs toward trouble, not away from it," Michelle said. "When kids need help, she's there. When families can't afford food, she finds a way. When the community center was about to close, she saved it. The only threat that morning was a threat to her dignity. And that's something no badge gives you the right to take. During the lunch break, something unexpected happened. Davidson asked to speak to Sarah privately. James didn't want to allow it, but Sarah agreed. They met in a small conference room, just the two of them. My daughter won't talk to me, Davidson said, his voice breaking. She says she doesn't know who I am anymore. And she's right, I don't know either. He wiped his eyes with shaking hands. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mrs. Johnson. I just want to know how to fix what's broken inside me. Sarah looked at him for a long time. Start with the truth, she said softly. Not just in court, but to yourself, to your daughter, to every person you meet from now on. The badge didn't make you do this. You chose to forget we're all human. When court resumed, Davidson changed his plea to guilty. Reynolds followed. The judge asked Sarah what she wanted their punishment to be. The room held its breath. Here was her chance for revenge. I want them to serve our community, she said, standing tall. Not in jail, but at the center. Let them learn from the people they look down on. Let them teach other officers what they've learned. And make sure no mother ever has to explain to her child why someone who swore to protect her tied her to a pole instead. The judge agreed. It wasn't a typical sentence, but nothing about this case was typical. Along with community service, both officers would help create a new police training program. Their badges were suspended, but not permanently taken away. Earn them back, the judge said. Not from the department, but from your community. After court ended, people didn't want to leave. They hugged each other, cried together, talked about change. Katie ran up to Sarah with a new batch of paper hearts. Can we put these ones on the community center? She asked. Since the pole is gone? That evening, Sarah and James walked home together. The same route where it all happened, but different now. Neighbors waved from their porches, cars honked in support. Outside the hardware store where the pole used to be, someone had planted a small garden. You know what the hardest part was? Sarah told James as they walked. Not the handcuffs, not the pole, not even the laughing. It was seeing the kids' faces. They looked so lost, like their whole world stopped making sense. But today in court, I saw something different in their eyes. Hope. And that's worth more than any punishment. James hugged his wife close. You taught this whole town about justice, he said. Not the kind that comes from law books, the kind that comes from the heart. Sarah smiled, tired but peaceful. Tomorrow she'd be back at the center, reading stories, helping with homework, building the community she loved. And now maybe making it a little bit better for everyone. Change started in the smallest ways. Officer Rodriguez brought donuts to the community center every Tuesday morning, sitting with the elderly folks who once crossed the street when they saw her uniform. They taught her to play dominoes. She taught them their rights. Somewhere between moves, fear turned to friendship. The police academy looked different now. Sarah's pictures hung on walls once decorated with tough guy cop movies posters. New recruits watched the pole incident video on their first day, not as a warning about power, but as a lesson in humanity. This is what happens, their instructor said, when you forget the person behind the profile. Davidson found his way back slowly. He started by cleaning the community center after hours, too ashamed to face people. But Katie changed that. She caught him washing windows one evening, walked right up, and handed him a book. Miss Sarah says everybody deserves a second chance, she said, even people who did bad things. That night, he read to his own daughter for the first time in years. The changes spread like ripples. Body cameras became symbols of pride, not burden. Officers competed to show their best community interactions. Rodriguez's Domino's games turned into a monthly tournament, with cops and seniors trash-talking over tiles and coffee. Sarah watched it all from her tiny office, now crowded with thank you cards and children's drawings. Real change, she told James one evening, isn't in the rules we write, it's in the hearts we touch. She pointed to her window where Davidson was teaching Marcus how to change a tire, both laughing at some shared joke. The old guard resisted at first. They complained about soft policing and coddling criminals. But then something beautiful happened. Crime rates dropped, community tips increased, Kids started waving at patrol cars instead of running from them. Even the toughest cops couldn't argue with results. Reynolds found his calling teaching the Badge of Trust program. He brought in Mrs. Robinson to share her civil rights stories, watching tough officers cry as she described her father's struggle for dignity. Your uniform, she told each class, is not your armor. It's your promise to the community. 1 year after the incident, Sarah organized a community dinner in the police station parking lot. Officers grilled burgers while kids played basketball with their badges pinned to t-shirts. Katie's mom hugged Rodriguez, thanking her for teaching Katie's class about safety. Davidson's daughter came home, and at one table Mrs. Robinson taught the new police chief how to make her famous potato salad. Look what you built, James whispered to Sarah, watching their divided town become a community. She smiled, thinking of all the tears, all the hard conversations, all the small steps that led here. We built it together, she said, all of us, one heart at a time. The pole was gone, replaced by a small garden where kids and cops planted flowers together. They called it the Hope Garden, but everyone knew it by another name, Miss Sarah's Garden, because sometimes the best way to reform a system isn't to tear it down, but to help it grow into something beautiful. 5 years passed like a blink and a lifetime. The video still lives online, but Millbrook isn't that town anymore. Sarah's Community Center, once a safe haven for the forgotten, is now the heart of a changed city. Police officers volunteer there off-duty, reading to kids who now dream of wearing badges to protect, not to power. Katie, the little girl with paper hearts, just started high school. She leads a youth program called Badges and Books, where cops and kids read together. Davidson, now Officer Davidson again, his badge re-earned through years of humble service, helps her run it. Sometimes, he tells new recruits, your biggest mistake becomes your greatest teacher. Sarah's office wall tells the story best. Photos show the change. Rodriguez teaching self-defense to elderly women, Reynolds coaching youth basketball, rookie cops gardening with grandmas. But her favorite is a simple picture of last year's Christmas party. Black, white, brown, and blue uniforms all mixed together, sharing food and laughter like family. Remember when this was just a dream? James asked her one evening, watching kids play basketball with officers in the center's new gym. Sarah smiled, touching the silver bangles she still wears to remind her of that day. It was never just a dream, she said. It was a promise we all needed to keep. The pole incident sparked changes across America. Other cities sent officers to learn the Millbrook way. Sarah travels sometimes, sharing their story, but she always comes back to her center, to her kids, to her community, that prove change isn't just possible, it's inevitable when hearts open and hands join. Mrs. Robinson, now 92, still comes to Domino's tournaments. She watches officers and neighbors compete, remembering different times. Baby, she told Sarah recently, we didn't just change a police department, we changed minds, we changed hearts. And that's the kind of change that sticks. The garden where the pole once stood blooms year-round now. Every spring, new flowers join the old, planted by new hands, tended by all. A small plaque reads, here, our community chose love over fear, understanding over anger, and growth over division. May we never forget the price of forgetting our shared humanity. Last week, a young officer graduated top of her class at the academy. During her speech, she told the crowd how she decided to become a cop. I was 12 when I watched a video of a woman tied to a pole, but that's not what changed me. What changed me was watching that same woman build a bridge between blue uniforms and broken trust. Miss Sarah taught us all that real power isn't in controlling others. It's in lifting them up. Sarah still walks to work every morning, but now patrol cars slow down to wave. Officers stop for coffee at Mrs. Chen's store. Kids high-five cops on street corners. The invisible lines that once divided their town have faded like old scars, still there to remind them, but no longer defining them. Some people ask if I forgave them, Sarah tells new groups at the center. But this was never about forgiveness. It was about transformation, about choosing who we want to be as a community, about remembering that behind every badge, every skin color, every job or title, there's a human heart capable of change. Tonight, as Sarah locks up the center, She pauses to watch the sunset paint their town in gold. A patrol car pulls up. It's Rodriguez, bringing her granddaughter to tomorrow's reading circle. They hug like sisters, remembering how far they've come. Tonight, as Sarah locks up the center, she pauses to watch the sunset paint their town in gold. A patrol car pulls up. It's Rodriguez, bringing her granddaughter to tomorrow's reading circle. They hug like sisters, remembering how far they have come. The world isn't perfect. There's still work to do, bridges to build, hearts to change. But in Millbrook, they've learned the most valuable lesson. When you tie someone to a pole, you bind yourself to ignorance. But when you choose to grow together, you set everyone free. Miss Sarah, see you tomorrow, Katie calls out, walking home with her badges and books team. Sarah waves, her heart full. Because tomorrow is what they've all been working for. A tomorrow where badges mean protection, not power. Where differences bring strength, not separation. Where a small town's big change keeps rippling out into the world, one heart at a time.